lovelies, welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. How are you doing? Hope everyone's all right. Thank you for joining me. If you are joining me for the first time, then I release my content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously, so make sure you get the notification on. Subscribe, ideally. Give me a like, give me a hello, write a comment, just have a chat. Come to one of my live chats, because every time I release new content, I'm usually there having a natter with you lot. So if you haven't tried that yet, please come. My community is amazing. I am completely biased, but let me tell you, it is the kindest and nicest place that you are going to find on YouTube. Everyone is super supportive, so do join me. Also, thank you to all my Patreon followers. I really appreciate it. You are going to be blessed with a podcast with an amazing DCI, Paul Settle. He has been through the mill. And he's also one of those coppers who just like tells you it as it is. So like, I don't really say a lot because I'm just like asking him really intrusive questions. But the consequence is that it's really worth a listen. And he's going to be doing like a series of bits and pieces about true crime and giving us some insight into exactly what takes place in investigations. My God, he's so good at talking. Like, I did hours with him yesterday and was just so nosy. He was meant to be in charge of the Jimmy Savile case, but actually in the end, he became part of U-Tree and then other associated cases. And it was incredible kind of getting that insight. So make sure if you are a Patreon fan that you listen to those, because it's absolutely awesome. As ever, today we are going to be covering a horrible case where people lose their lives. Just to put that in context, if you aren't used to listening to true crime, that is basically what my channel is about. But hopefully when we tell the story at the end, you'll feel like there has definitely been justice done. I like a case where there is justice at the end. Today I'm going to be covering the case of Gary Allen, and it's one of those cases that you kind of recoil from because it wasn't fair what happened in this case. It wasn't okay that because of certain processes, he managed to get away with murder for a very, very long time. And when we think about these kind of individuals, it's really telling that we're probably at a position in time now when investigations are concerned that we are luckier than ever. I know at times, and I'm the first one to say this, it feels like we're living in some deep police state. I really mean that. You know, you're like, CCTV, you could just play my life and I'll just get older. I just walk out of my door because it's everywhere. And it can feel like really overarching. And there are boundaries, absolute boundaries that need to be in place. But as far as finding criminals and making sure they're brought to justice, you know, we've never been in a better position because of DNA, because of CCTV, because of the way that we operate in our society. So to some degree, this is going to tell a story because historically those things didn't exist in the way they do now when he was getting away with murder. I also think it's worth knowing that when you think about criminals, you know, some are so dangerous that the police will go to absolutely incredible lengths and time just to spend money and resources all about bringing them to justice. And that's really important because I'm the first person to call into account the police. I'm the first person who will call out what I consider a lack of process, a lack of procedure that leads to individuals escaping and getting away with murder. But equally, we have to give them credit because there are some police departments and they are like a dog with a bone. It's as simple as that. They get a case. It really doesn't matter how cold it gets, it kind of still bubbles beneath the surface. And this is testament to the case that I'm going to cover today. Gary Allen is one of those heinous, dangerous individuals that the police didn't want to let go of. They didn't want to let him escape. So Gary Allen was born in 1974 in South Yorkshire. I have to say, when you explore his youth, how can I say this politely? He had all the telltale signs of being a monster in the making. And that is not something I say lightly. You all know that I tend to analyse individuals and try to find the good and at least explore what could have created that human being. But you know, early on, even as a very young child, we start to see some very worrying signs. He's first referred to a psychiatrist when he was 8 years old. And even though this is a good thing, of course, if a child's behaviour is out of line or seems disturbing or worrying, or we feel that there is some kind of requirement for an assessment, that's an important thing to happen. And that's a positive thing to happen. And ideally, that sees treatment plans and development plans in school, sometimes assisted help with lessons, and undoubtedly, if there is some psychiatric need, a system is in place, therefore, to make sure that that individual is cradled through the years particularly as we reach adolescence, which is where we see the real bedrock of problems. As a kid, one of the reasons that he's sent to that psychiatrist is he had absolutely uncontrollable temper tantrums, really excessive aggression and violence towards his siblings. And I know, we've all been there with kids. We've all been there with kids when you suddenly hear that noise and you know it's not a normal noise in the house because it sounds like somebody may have fallen downstairs or somebody's head may have been cracked against the wall. And even in a peaceful household like me, where I've never even shouted at my kids or hit my kids, let me tell you, I've heard those noises. So we know aggression in childhood is common. You just have to pick your kid up from preschool and they've gone and bitten another kid. It's part and parcel of growing up. But we're talking massively excessive aggression right now, dangerously so. And he also had a real reputation earlier on for starting fires. That's right, for setting fire to things as a child. Again, I'm the first to admit, when I was 6 years old, I did set fire to my Uncle Derek's curtains in the Lake District. It wasn't a clever move. I was behind those curtains, in the curtains, when I set fire to them. Fortunately, my father was present. I was a child, remember. That's why I went behind the curtains in a very small cottage and set them on fire with my dad right next to me. Hardly sophisticated if I was trying to get away with it. But what I'm saying is, again, not unusual behaviour, she says, after admitting that she did. Not unusual behaviour for occasionally being interested in matches, which I might have been. But this kid had a big reputation. And when we think about that, we've got some real indicators here. So there is a triad called the McDonald triad. The McDonald triad is something that we expect to see in pretty much all serial killers. Or shall we say, very violent offenders who also have what would be considered psychopathic disorder. Now, the McDonald triad is one that kind of tells us and gives us insight into what we'd expect to see in these individuals. And two of the main things are being aggressive and violent, sometimes to animals, sometimes to other people, and pyromania. So setting fire to lots of things. Son of Sam, good example, set fire to 1,400 places in New York. Also turned out to be a very dangerous killer. So these are big indicators of problems. And like I'm saying, if you occasionally hit your sibling and had a bit of a penchant for setting fire to a couple of things in your life, you're not one. I'm just saying, put that on steroids and we have a problem. His behaviour later became really, really bad, to a point where his parents agreed for him to go into Baynard House in Hull, and he spent 2 residential periods there at a child psychiatric unit. That was between January 1982 and July 1983. So come on, we are dealing with seriously problematic behaviour. You do not end up in a psychiatric unit as a child unless there is something deeply concerning about your behaviour. And we also have to acknowledge that unlike a lot of our murderers, this is an individual who was in the system, who had been acknowledged as a problem, and testament to his parents, who was receiving at least some kind of systemic approach to his psychiatric needs. So to all intents and purposes, this is at a point in time where there is intervention occurring. And my God, let me tell you, that isn't the case in modern Britain, and I'm sure it's the same all over the world. We have absolutely lost a lot of these opportunities. So he is getting this kind of support. The staff, when they were looking after him, were really concerned about the way that he operated personality-wise. They felt that he was, I suppose, to bring in some kind of cliche word, a Jekyll and Hyde personality to some degree. They noted a split personality. Now, we're not talking about dissociative disorder. We're not talking about somebody having alters. We're talking about an individual that goes from one extreme to the other. So he could go from really pleasant, really placid to an incredibly intense rage in basically a second. And when he was in that home, he was very violent to other children. There was literally a catalogue of attacks on other children that he was residing with. That in itself introduces us to this idea that we have a problem if a child is being taken care of in a unit like this, where essentially behaviour is meant to be modified and also therapeutically dealt with, yet it escalates to some degree his behaviour. And that's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? We place a child in a position where ideally they're going to get the help that they deserve and need and require. We also put them with vulnerable children and also children who have temperaments that are maybe quite explosive. Does that work is something that I think begs question, because sometimes we end up putting the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. And I think in this case, it probably exacerbated some of his issues. Nonetheless, they were doing their best, clearly. 6 years after he actually left that place, he attacked his own mother. He attacked his own mother with a metal clothes prop. And I know you'll be like, oh, well, you know, these things happen at the end of the day. People get into escalations with their children. She was probably having a big row with him and she was grounding him and he just like lost control. And to some degree, even though that's reprehensible, you can kind of see how these things happen. Although leave the prop because that's pretty dangerous. But no, he attacked her when she was in bed recovering from surgery. Sounds like a delightful child to have around, doesn't he? So high-level violence in the home, domestic abuse. And also, when you hit somebody with a metal prop, you could kill them. So it shows serious intent and possibility of consequential harm, right? When he's 14, he's seen to grab a girl by the throat and he then pushes her to the ground and he actually hits her head really badly. So this is, again, something that could have caused a really catastrophic effect. A year later, after this attack, he tries to strangle the 15-year-old son of his foster carer. Open your home to him, tries to murder your child. That's what we're talking about. So again, really high-level violence. Now, it seems that when it came to Alan deciding what he wanted to do future-wise, there was probably a need for some discipline. It doesn't matter how violent he was. It doesn't mean that an individual doesn't have a recognition and a conscience of the fact that there is something lacking in their world. And we see very violent teenagers growing into individuals who become more peaceful with discipline. And often that involves doing things like joining the army, and that's what Alan does. I don't think that's unusual. I used to work with a lot of young offenders, and one of the main goals that they would have was to join the forces, whether that be the Navy, the Air Force, or the Army. And it usually was, with respect, the Army. And the reason for that was they had come from very chaotic backgrounds. And even though they hated order, believe me, I ran the projects, you know. It took me a year to socialise them before we could even think about education, and rightfully so. They'd had really hard lives. But the job and duty there was to allow them chaos before they could create some kind of order. And I think that most of them were seeking something that felt safe. So the army did that. And Alan goes to the army, so that possibly says that he had some insight about the fact that he wanted to actually have order in his world. Equally, it could be that he had a pawn shop wanting to kill people. So it kind of met both of those, didn't it? Well, get a bit of order, 3 meals a day, and the good meals. I get some comrades, people that I can connect with, talk to, and on top of that, I might get to kill a few people, which is something latent within who I am. Now, he got stationed in Germany, and when he was there, he threw a TV through a window in a rage when Britain's entry for Eurovision failed to win. I mean, it's hard for all of us to bear, isn't it? I mean, also, bit of advice, if that's kind of a trigger for you, don't watch Eurovision or you'll never win. It's known. It wouldn't matter if Take That did it. Wouldn't matter if Little Mix did it. We're always going to lose. You could just have me on a stage, I'd score as well. Maybe even better, you know? They'd feel sorry for me. So again, not got any impulse control, has he? He's not got any self-regulation. At 21, he goes and threatens a housemate with a large diver's knife. So he's used to getting his own way, isn't he? Because obviously he isn't going ahead and slitting somebody's throat at this point. Yes, it's escalation behaviour. Yes, he's starting to now get weapons involved, but the threatening isn't the actual intent of him killing. So it says something, doesn't it, about him wanting to bully, wanting to control his environment. He's not afraid to put people in positions where they do whatever he wants because he uses force. But we're not at the point where he's murdering anyone, but it says something about his mindset, which is that if you don't fold, he will make you. 2 years after that, he tells a friend that his car's been damaged by someone, And the way he expresses dealing with this is that he says he claimed that he tracked the guy down and he smashed his fingers. And I have no doubt whatsoever that that was likely, that for retribution for doing something to him that he felt was a violation, that he could then arguably go and dish out this cold justice because as far as he was concerned, somebody had disrespected him. So we can see, can't we, from pretty much the get-go, he's got real anger management issues. One of the things that seems to shift, though, is as he gets older and he gets more control over his environment, there seems to be this ebbing away from other human beings. He becomes a real loner. And as he grows into this more loner type individual, he also starts to up this ante on his views towards women. He gets this really intensely warped view of women. He hates them. Think about sociopathic behaviour. So obviously when we look at sociopathic and psychopathic, they're kind of interchangeable, but sociopathic, we would say, are more on the fringe of society. So less likely to be individuals who connect and engage and have charismatic relationships or even relationships with people. That in itself starts to indicate that we have some problems because he's isolating himself, but he hates women. And who he hates more than anything, female-wise, are prostitutes. Which drives me insane. There is this thing, isn't there, in our culture where a prostitute is deemed less important than other women, sisters, daughters, mothers, friends. You know, it drives me crazy that we have this very monolithic perspective. And even though I know everybody listening to this values prostitutes and sex workers exactly the same as anybody else, and rightfully so, there is still a stereotype in our society. Even in 2021, there's a stereotype in our society about, oh, well, those individuals put themselves out there. I have people in positions of power say that. And unfortunately, that devalues the reality of who that person is. He used to refer to them as the lowest of the low. Sorry, Gary Allen, the lowest of the low. Sex workers who get paid for a service and just do that, thus allowing you to, if you want to have sex with them, have that transaction without any violence and without any fear. And pretty much they do what they say they do, you know? Bit of an authentic transaction going on there. As opposed to you, who just smash people's fingers up indiscriminately, hold knives to people's throats, beat the crap out of girls, things like that. You sound like a delicious, delightful human being. Irony beyond belief. Just have a big irony sign over his head at that point. Now, he first comes to the attention of the police because somehow he hasn't come to the attention of the police. And this is the irony, isn't it? So many people get away with violence, so many people get away with really antisocial behaviour, and people don't actually speak to the police about them. People just put it down to bad moments in their lives. And really, we should all be vigilant to the fact that when people are going around attacking individuals from an early age, every single one of those should be noted. So in 1997, Samantha Class is murdered, and Gary Allen comes to their attention because of this. Now, Samantha was 29 when she was killed. She was just a really young woman. Horrifically, her body was actually discovered by 3 schoolgirls on the foreshore of the Humber Estuary in North Ferriby on the 26th of October 1997. And when they discovered her, the body was partially submerged in mud. And they also noted that some items of her clothing were missing. These items included a shoe, her knickers, her tights, and they were all found upstream a few days later. Traces of blood were also found at the location. Now, Samantha was a single mum of 3. She had 3 children, Sophia, Aidan and Lewis. She had been working as a prostitute, but she'd been working in a prostitute in Hull for one reason. She wanted to support her family. That was it. Her main priority was feeding her children. She was last seen on the evening of 25th of October, and she went out to work. She left her children with carers. So again, think about that. This is a responsible woman. She wasn't going out to feed her habit. She left her children in the care of people. She went to earn money to protect her family. She basically encountered Gary Allen, who was 24 at the time, around midnight. He's driving his car, looking around for a prostitute to have sex with. He pulls up and, as standard, asks Samantha to get into his vehicle, and her body's found the next morning. She had been brutally murdered. She suffered 33 injuries and they were all over her body. These included cluster injuries to her head and body and multiple broken ribs. So when we say cluster injuries to her head and body, it means repeatedly punching. So it doesn't necessitate that the injury is just one, it's a cluster of injuries in that context. Also, she had loads of internal bleeding, and that was caused by her injuries that occurred to her heart, her spleen, her liver, her adrenal glands, and her kidneys. So just picture that. That's pretty much every vital organ, right? Think about the sustained brutality that is required to create injuries like that. The autopsy actually returned and said that she'd been viciously beaten, stamped on, and she'd also been strangled to death with a ligature. And then, if that wasn't brutal, if that wasn't soul destroying enough to know, what they also reported was that her lifeless body had then been driven over with a car as she lay face down in the mud. And then the person had taken her body, crumpled, broken, and thrown her into the Humber. For those of you who don't know what the Humber is, it's a large tidal estuary, a massive body of water, and it's on the east coast of the north of England. So it's a really horrible place to imagine throwing a body. It's really deep, really cold, really dark, and vast. Now, even though Samantha's body had been in water, which we all know can corrupt DNA and can get rid of evidence, because they found her relatively quickly, they did manage to recover some DNA. And even though they got this semen from her, they couldn't match it at the time. So there was no DNA match on the computer register, which meant that the person who'd carried out the apparent crime, or allegedly could have carried out the crime, wasn't somebody known to police. Now, this changes in 1998. Alan's driving, and he's driving erratically. So at this point, the police pull him over. They find out that he's over the drink drive limit. And because of that, just a standard procedure, they take a DNA sample. Instantly, when they put that through the computer, it's matched, and it matches the semen taken from Samantha's body. So Gary Allen's arrested, immediately is like, I've had nothing to do with this, I am completely innocent. But what he does say, and you remember what I talk about in some of my other videos, one of the things that clever criminals do is they minimize their involvement in something, but they take some responsibility for a certain element of it. And it's a way of trying to say, well, I'm willing to say that I did this, I'm just not willing to admit to that, to try to garner some sympathy, empathy, and also some belief by the parties who are questioning you as a potential guilty suspect. So he tells the officers, yeah, I did. I drove to the red light area of Hull on the 25th of October 1997. I did meet Samantha. I paid her 30 quid for sex. And at the end of the day, that's all I'm guilty of. When the police try to find his car, because they want to therefore look whether there are any forensic details that they can take from it, it turns out that pretty much just after the murder of Samantha, he's just scrapped it. He's just gone and scrapped it. Because that's what you do, isn't it, with cars? I mean, most of us just sell them, get a bit of cash if it's still working. But not him. He's like, no, I don't sell things. I just take them to the scrapyard and have them made into a small metal box. So instantly that's going to get the police's attention, because why on earth would you do that? The police believe that they've got an incredibly strong case. They believe it's bang to rights. They really do. And when they go to trial in 2000, they think there is no way that he's going to get away with what they consider a clear, open and shut case. Because they have semen, they have prostitute that's been murdered, they have an admission by Gary Allen that he was there and he saw her that night, and also he scrapped his car. So the guilty verdict seems like a foregone conclusion. Gary Allen, unsurprisingly, says, I wasn't guilty, it wasn't me. So he says, basically, Samantha had been the second of two sex workers he'd been with on the 25th of October 1997. He totally had sex with her, but as far as he was concerned, she was safe and well when he left her. He also added to this situation by saying, look, Samantha did say that she wanted to lift home off me, but I told her she had to walk because I had something else I wanted to do. I wanted to go home. And he even said, look, one of the big issues for me is I feel really ashamed when I use prostitutes, and that I'd never even been to a red light district until that night. Although you were a busy little bee, weren't you, Gary Allen? According to your own testimony, because not only did you go once, apparently according to you, you had two prostitutes that night, which seems like an escalation of behaviour if you'd never used them before, that all of a sudden you weren't just confident enough to go and see one, you were like, oh, I may as well go and see two. Don't think I buy that, do you? Now, he also gives an excuse for scrapping his car and says, look, I owed my flatmate money. I wanted to pay my way and I was staying in his living room, so I needed to get some cash quick. Because obviously, you couldn't just sell it and get even more money. I don't know about you, I've scrapped a car. I got about 40 quid for it back in the day. So I'm not buying it, but nonetheless, I suppose it could be believable. The police were stunned, because ultimately the jury found him not guilty. Even the people watching the court case were really shocked, because it was considered to be this open and shut case. So even people who were just witnessing the whole trial play out felt it was a sure thing. Even the defense barrister, the person who was defending Gary Allen, was blindsided. He didn't think he was going to win. No one else was actually ever tried for Samantha's murder. And I'll tell you why, because the police were not looking for any other suspects. So this didn't end the trial, and the police were like, oh, seems we got the wrong guy. They were like, we got the right guy. No even reason to look anywhere else. This guy got off with murder. They were absolutely convinced that they had the right man. And they believed that he had managed to get away scot-free, which must be so aggravating. You know, they put a lot of work into this. They didn't let Samantha's memory go cold. They gave her legacy by trying it. They thought that they were going to get a dangerous man off the streets, and they didn't. And the problem with that is, imagine being a murderer. Imagine being Gary Allen, the psychology of him. You know, you've got a superiority complex. You've got quite an aggressive nature. You're an individual who now has just been reinforced massively. You literally can get away with murder. That isn't something that offers consequential understanding to a series of actions that were catastrophic to other people. No, you get off. Therefore, you feel that the actions that you have taken are, one, potentially justified because, hey, you managed to get away with it. Secondly, within your frame of conscience, it reinforces your behavior because why not do it again? And most importantly, it means that you feel this level of arrogance towards authority. You had me and you let me go. That's hardly going to reduce the offending behavior. And it does seem that that acquittal spurred on his thirst for violence because he genuinely thought he could commit crimes and get away with it. On the day he walked free from court, Allen was given some money, dropped off at Sheffield train station, and he was told, you need to leave Yorkshire. You need to get away as far as possible from Yorkshire. So essentially, they wanted to export any future potential elsewhere. And that's how Gary Allen actually ends up in Plymouth. So soon after the trial, Allen again is pretty much quickly on the police radar. And it doesn't feel at any point like, in spite of what's happened historically, that he intends to keep a low profile. So he's arrested for 2 attacks on sex workers in Plymouth in March and April 2000. That's only a 4-week gap between each. So we're seeing a real escalation in his behaviour. And it means that Plymouth unknowingly have got this very dangerous man wandering their streets. In both cases with the attacks, he'd taken the prostitutes to dark, secluded places. He then choked them and he attempted to sexually assault them. One of the victims said that he grabbed her by her throat, he pushed her to the ground, hit her face, and then he stuck his fingers down her throat. At this point, he then tries to rip off her clothes, but because a lorry driver was passing, he called the police seeing this, which is testament to that lorry driver, because the likelihood is something utterly dreadful would have befallen that particular prostitute. So this individual calls the police, and obviously Gary Allen is stopped. The second victim says that he grabbed her throat, pushed her to the ground, and again, pushed his fingers into her mouth. At this point, again, when you think that the universe is on your side, he's spotted by a passing police dog handler and arrested, which is divine intervention, in my belief. Just the idea of there he is, brazenly abusing this innocent individual, And who walks past but a police dog handler who just arrests him straight away? Brilliant. So Gary Allen at this point is charged with attempted assault, occasioning actual bodily harm, and indecent assault. And he's found guilty, sentenced to 5.5 years in prison in December 2000. And with respect, he doesn't get out after his sentence because he is such a nightmare whilst he's in prison that he gets his sentence extended to almost double the time, nearly 10 years, because extra time's added for various breaches. So again, what is that giving us insight into? Because when somebody goes to prison, and let's put this in perspective, 31% of very violent criminals in prison are psychopaths. They meet that classification. So a little bit like when he's in the psychiatric unit, are we getting a de-escalation of his behaviour? Are we getting a reduction in his psychological harm when he's spending time in those places, in those prisons? Or are we getting the very opposite? Because to nearly double your sentence says something powerful, doesn't it? It says you're not really that bothered about being in prison. It's more important to you to act in a way according to your feelings. So with the consequences of getting extra time, they do not register for Gary Allen. That shows you an incredible lack of impulse control, because most of us would be doing everything within our diligence personally to get out. That's what you do. And if you're somebody who doesn't think about the potential impact of your actions in the moment, you are somebody who is very, very dangerous per se. One of the incidents that meant that he stayed in prison included one in 2004. He'd been released early on licence and he just removed his electronic tagging device. That shows you again, he's more interested in his needs than the needs of those in authority above him. So in 2010 he gets released and he has to attend regular meetings with probation officers, of course. During one of these meetings, Gary Allen starts talking to his probation officer about how much he absolutely loathes and despises prostitutes, which is ironic when you're visiting them. Isn't that a strange psychology? You know, that you're in a position where you can be vitriolic against an individual that you have intimate sex with. What is that saying about him? Because he's the one soliciting those individuals and using those individuals for his own potential gain and sexual connection, and yet for whatever reason he disassociates himself from the reality of that intimacy and instead brands them as shameful, disgusting individuals. So on one level he requires them, and on another level he hates them because he requires them. And that emotional cognitive dissonance must be incredibly challenging to hold. And one of his probation officers later reports that he basically spoke openly about his strong dislike of prostitutes. He described prostitutes as being scum, the lowest of the low. And he also admitted to his probation officer that he planned and subsequently committed the attacks on the prostitutes in Plymouth. He even said that he targeted prostitutes because they'll go with anyone. He stated that. He said that he had this desire to feel the pleasure of wanting to hurt people, that he had this planning stage. Think about all of our serial killers. In Gary Allen's own words, he says, the pleasure of hurting builds from the planning stage. Prostitutes are easy targets. I just want to hurt people. Can't tell you how far. You know, I can't tell you what I want to do to them. I enjoy thinking about it. I get pleasure from the thinking. I just really enjoy different types of violence. That must have been terrifying for the probation officer to hear. Because whilst on one level you're like, lock him away immediately and throw away the key. Ideally in a cell with just a bathroom and a little box that you can put food in for the rest of eternity so he never has to come into contact with a human being. That's how you feel, and that's how the probation officer would feel. But what can you do if there's no crime being committed? We are in a situation where the individual can fantasize as much as they wish to until it's occurred. What can you do about it? Gary Allen then goes on to tell another probation officer that he'd actually fantasized about restraining a prostitute and basically telling her that he was going to kill her and to hurt her, even saying that no one would ever see her again. I mean, we are in serial killer territory, aren't we? Remember what the definition of a serial killer is? A serial killer is defined as an individual who kills two people at separate times with a cooling off period. So essentially, if he was looking at killing somebody else or does kill someone else, he falls into that category. He also said that whenever he came across sex workers, he would kind of have this fantasy instantly come into play as to what he would do to them. And another probation he worked with, he basically said, I like frightening them. I like causing them pain. I want to make them cry. I like blood. I like to hurt them and I enjoy it. It makes me feel good. You just want to run in, don't you? And like grab him, put him in a straitjacket, remove him to local mental health unit, leave. Leave. That's what you'd want to do. I guess those probation officers would go home with their own personal fantasy as to what they would like to do with said Gary Allen. I know that I have a few in my own head. What we're seeing here as well is an organised offender. So an organised offender is characterised by an individual who plans. It's not something that is spontaneous. It's not a blitz killing. It's not an individual who goes out and just spontaneously carries out the attack. What we see is an escalation in the fantasy play and a rumination almost over the areas that they really get a sense of enjoyment over sexually, the idea of what they're going to do to their victim, the idea of how they're going to harm their victim, the idea of how they're going to select their victim. And even the fact that when he goes and sees prostitutes, he might not be carrying out these behaviours with each of them, but when he sees them, he kind of locks in on the fantasy, and then even in fantasy mode is doing all these horrible things to them, even if he's not actually acting out that behaviour. So we see this in people who are serial killers, we really do. They love organising the offence from the moment that they think about the potential to the moment that they carry out the actual effect. And that could go on for months and months and months, sometimes years. Look at somebody like Bind, Torture, Kill, BTK. Dennis Rader, he spent years planning at times. It was enough. So Gary Allen is super dangerous because this is something that he really connects with, and this is what we see with an organised offender. The fact that he enjoys inflicting violence from a young age all the way through as well, we have this consistency. So this is a very violent man. Now the attacks in 2000, it turned out, unsurprisingly, guys, you're not going to be sitting there going, oh, I'm very surprised that Gary Allen hadn't had any other attacks. I mean, he sounds like such a lovely young person. So it turns out he'd also been convicted for breach of sexual offences prevention order, 2 convictions for battery and an offence of possession of an offensive weapon. And actually it's clear that the police believed that Allen was a really dangerous sexual predator and killer. As far as they were concerned, this guy had great form and was very, very dangerous to be on our streets. And they were so convinced and so worried about the safety of local women that they decided they were going to launch an undercover operation. And that undercover operation was launched in 2010. It was called Operation Misty. And I'm going to tell you now, we give the police a hard time, and rightfully so. They are a public servant. Their duty is to serve the public and protect them. That's it. But sometimes we don't comment on all the amazing work that they do. And Operation Misty is profound. It really is. When you think about it, this is one man, and this is what the police do to try to apprehend that man, to protect people on the streets. So at the time that Operation Misty begins, Allen's moved to a place called Grimsby and he's living in a hostel. Now, at this time, Grimsby had a reputation for being the sort of place where someone who wanted to meet prostitutes would easily be able to find them without pretty much any difficulty. So the police created this Operation Misty, and what they did was they built this entire social world around Gary Allen. This whole sub-life. And it was all about getting him to reveal his involvement in Samantha's murder. So undercover officers, complete with fake girlfriends, wives and children, they all befriend Allen and they create this entirely fabricated world around him. There were 7 officers, 5 men, 2 women. They posed as Allen's friends, they built up relationships with him, and they did that over 2 years. So imagine the resources that went into that. Imagine the officers who lived their lives that way, essentially pretending to be people that they weren't, to find an opportunity to bring this man to justice. During that period of time, there were 400 hours of recordings that were secret that are taken from Gary Allen and those individuals, trying to get him to a position where he admits guilt. The officers were so clever. They were actors, of course they were, but you've got to think about what it would be like to essentially become another human being for up to 2 years. And the officers basically took on characters that were very much akin to Gary Allen. So personalities that reflected who he was. And they did that so they could strike up friendships with him. And one of the main precursors for the connection with Gary Allen to develop was the fact that the men who were police officers pretended that they were also people who were violent towards women. So they gave that connection, that permission base for Gary Allen to explore his own violence. Now, one officer who was known as Scott, he's the first to befriend Allen, and basically they move him into a flat nearby. He starts engaging with Gary Allen, and pretty much from the get-go, he makes it clear that he's an individual who's had convictions for domestic violence. Simultaneously, undercover officers also use pieces of theatre to convince Allen, and they gain his trust. On one occasion, this actually includes the burning of bloodstained clothes by an undercover officer who's referred to as Ian. So this is amazing, isn't it? This is like a film set, isn't it? That they're bringing in like pieces of evidence to substantiate the kind of characters that they're creating. Now, Ian claims that the evidence was from a crime scene in Holland where he had enemies. So this dark world where this guy has enemies. And it is to Ian that Gary Allen would ultimately make a really startling confession. So as part of the undercover act and of garnering Gary Allen's trust, Ian's arranged for him to do some work for him. Put work in inverted commas. I don't think it's going down to Aldi and doing a shift on the cashiers. I don't think it's doing some landscaping for a neighbour. I think it's a type of work that the mafia would be doing. And it is. So basically Ian says, like, you need to help me. I need you to go and kill one of my associates abroad. And during the conversation, Gary Allen basically says to Ian, oh, okay, you don't have to worry about me. I've done this before. Ian at this point has to stop the conversation. The reason why is because Gary Allen's been drinking at this point, so understandably the police can't be like, we coerced a drunk man into making a confession, and it wouldn't have made strong evidence, but they've got that insight that Gary Allen has admitted that he has killed before, and that he has a trust-based relationship with this individual who he feels is on an equal footing because Ian himself is meant to have been involved in killings. So we have a foundation where the relationship to some degree feels equal. Gary Allen is in a position of trusting others. Now, 5 days later, that's the 6th of December 2010, Gary Allen's had some time to think, right? He's had some time to think about what he said. And at this point, he claims he never actually killed anyone, but he wants to make it clear to Ian that in spite of the fact that he kind of made that up, for him, violence wasn't a problem, which we all know is true. However, on the 16th of February 2011, officers get a breakthrough. And I'll tell you why. Because the thing about Gary Allen, and like a lot of our killers, ego. They just can't help it, can they? I mean, they can contain it for a period of time, sometimes 30 years, like BTK. But for the most part, those loose lips, they just can't help themselves, can they? And Gary Allen finally admits that he killed Samantha Class in 1997 whilst he's having a conversation with Ian. And he tells the story. He says he'd approached Samantha for sex, and they had had sex in his car. At some point, she had threatened to report him for rape and demanded all his cash after the condom had split. So basically, she was going to say, you know, I've got your DNA, condom split, give me money, or I'm going to the police. Bollocks, in my opinion. Why would she? Why would she do that? What has she possibly got to gain? You know, she has sex regularly with people for money. The condom split. Why would that suggest that she'd been raped? Lots of prostitutes have sex with men without condoms. You might have to pay a little bit more, but you get your way. So the police are not going to be like, oh yeah, this is definitely rape. I think this is him justifying what he wanted to do. We know how he feels about prostitutes. We certainly know his MO about desiring what he wants to do with prostitutes. So why are we going to think that she's the individual causing this situation? But again, he's minimizing, he's justifying, he's kind of making it so he's the victim in this. And he says, you know what, she said that and I just lost it. In fact, he also tells Ian just before he killed her, the way that he managed to get her to kind of wait so that he could kill her was to say to her, I'm going to go get a wallet, but actually he had a piece of string in the back of his car, and instead of getting his wallet, he got that and then strangled her. Unbelievable. I'm going to let you listen to the recording.
Well, I'll tell you the truth, but you're probably not going to want to know me afterwards, but if you want to know, I'll tell you. The truth of the matter is that, years ago when I was depressed and I had sex with prostitutes about 4 or 5 times in a few years because of the depression and stuff. And I had sex with this prostitute one night, and the condom split. And she said, blah de blah, if you don't, I want your name and I want your address, your money and everything else, I'm going to tell the police you raped me. So I strangled her. And I dumped her in the Humber. Serious. Yeah. Anyway, the police had DNA in that, but I went on the database. The reason I went on the database was because I'm never in any trouble. I've not led a criminal lifestyle and that. So, anyway, I got done for drink driving and the DNA that way, and they arrested me and that, and I went to court and everything. And I just said, listen, yeah, I had sex with her last night in the condom bus, but that was it. As far as I'm concerned, she went on her way and I went on my way. Obviously, I ain't going to tell them the truth. No, I'm serious, man. I went to Sheffield Crown Court and I got found not guilty. And I had a mate living in Plymouth who I've since fell out with because his missus had him under the and that. And the police were that desperate to get evidence that basically were interviewing everybody I'd known, even people I hadn't spoken to him and stuff like that, because he had nothing on me. All it was the fact that I'd had sex with her. Well, no, because that thing with that Samantha Class, as I say, I told you about that, what happened there. The condom split, and she said, well, if you don't give me this, that and the other, and you don't start giving me money and that, I'm going to tell the police you raped me. And I just flipped and I killed her and dumped her. But that's just the way I was then. You know what I mean? I thought, you know what I mean? So.
Now, even though we have a situation where Gary Allen has now confessed, it's going to be tough to try him again. Because even though they've got a recorded confession, there are issues with procedure, because before 2003, there was a double jeopardy rule applied to crimes in the UK. Now, what does double jeopardy mean? Well, it means that if you're tried of an offence and you're acquitted, you can't be retried at a later date. This was the case regardless of what evidence was later found to prove a suspect's guilt. Imagine how frustrating that would be for the police. And the reason for that is it was designed to protect individuals and to ensure that they couldn't be repeatedly tried by the state for the same offence without really good reason. And it also, I guess, ensured that there was closure for people who were found not guilty at the trial. However, it has to be recognised that double jeopardy meant that many guilty people escaped justice. And there's a great example of this, the case of William Dunlop. So he confessed to a prison officer in 1999 that he killed 22-year-old Julie Hogg 10 years before. However, he'd already been tried and acquitted of a murder. He could therefore only be charged with perjury for lying during that trial. The 1999 Macpherson report into the Stephen Lawrence case, massive report after the murder of Stephen Lawrence, also recommended that the double jeopardy rule should be removed to allow a further prosecution if fresh evidence emerged. Sensible, right? Fresh evidence emerges, we've got fresh evidence to prosecute. Now, thankfully, exceptions to the double jeopardy rule were introduced by the Criminal Justice Act in 2003. And it said, in certain very limited circumstances, a person who was acquitted of a crime could now be reinvestigated and retried. And one reason for this was advancements in DNA evidence. Of course. Incredible, right? DNA is a whole new ball game. The ability to match traces at a crime scene to specific individuals had a huge impact upon criminal cases. So now, fortunately, Ha, not for you, Gary Allen. The law now allows double jeopardy rules to be set aside where new compelling evidence of a person's guilt becomes available. Rightly so, Christ, rightly so. Imagine all the people who have not been allowed their justice of their loved ones who've been murdered and have watched individuals who they know have done it get away with it because of this rule. And we understand the legitimacy of why that rule exists. Of course we don't somebody tried again at Her Majesty's pleasure, because that would be psychologically soul destroying and also fundamentally very expensive, and we have to have certain cut-off points, but there also always needs to be room to adjust these where an individual who is very dangerous could be walking our streets, right? And like I said, when they look at applying the reinvestigation, it has to be only of the most serious offences such as murder and rape. Also, it's worth noting that the Director of Public Prosecutions has to confirm that the retrial is in the public interest, and they have to grant consent for prosecution to make application to the Court of Appeal. So it is a lengthy and challenging process. It isn't a simple, oh yeah, let's just do that. The Court of Appeal can then make a decision as to whether they want to order a retrial. And this is what the police investigating Allen were hoping for. Now, first, they have to go about gathering sufficient new and compelling evidence. That's the benchmark. It has to be new, it has to be compelling. Allen's confession to the undercover police officer was basically the first piece of this jigsaw. But in the years that follow, the police have to build a bigger case, a better case. So they keep an eye on Allen. That's what they're doing constantly. By 2018, I know this is really stressful, isn't it? Because this is 2018. Think about when he carried out the first crime. This guy has been walking our streets for a long time, albeit it's had 10 years inside, but it is terrifying, isn't it? To imagine that a known murderer is on the streets. So he's living in Rotherham. He's moved there in 2012. He's 45 years of age. And it's here that he meets 38-year-old Alena Grlakova. She's at a bus stop and he's on his way to work at a factory, and that's how they connect. It turns out she's moved from her native Slovakia to South Yorkshire 10 years earlier with her husband and 4 children. By the time that she actually becomes acquainted with Gary Allen, her life's taken a really difficult downward spiral. She was actually planning on returning to Slovakia because she wants to be reunited with her children who had basically returned there with their father. So obviously she's had quite a dysfunctional experience. She will be feeling very lonely, very isolated, and probably quite low in her mood. She separated from her husband in 2013, and the reason for that was because she'd become addicted to drugs and alcohol. So she's obviously self-medicating her pain. She obviously has a substantial issue with her own mental health because of this. And what does that make her? It makes her highly vulnerable. And to some degree, to Gary Allen, it also makes her available. And we absolutely know that when serial killers are looking for victims, they like available, they like vulnerable. Ideally, they like desirable as well. But to some degree, she is certainly in a precarious position knowing what we know about Gary Allen. It also turns out that she's taken up prostitution to support her habit. What does that tell you about Allen? Well, he has all of those negative feelings about her job. He has all of those negative feelings about the kind of human being that she is. We know this. It's really sad because this woman, this mother, she got to the point where she would literally sell her body, not for money, but just for food and shelter. That's how low she was. What is happening in our society? What is happening in our society where people end up in this situation? I don't give a shit about whether they're dependent on drugs and alcohol. I don't care. That doesn't mean that they don't deserve to be cared for. In the UK, we have ridiculous amounts of empty houses. What is going on? We have situations where hostels won't take people in if they have any alcohol or drugs in the system. Well, that's ridiculous. That's ludicrous. You have drugs and alcohol in your system because you're struggling massively and you're prostituting yourself just to get food and shelter. So what we'll do is we'll deny you food and shelter so that you have to keep prostituting yourself to feed your habit, as opposed to maybe giving you some dignity, maybe giving you a little bit of hope. What we are doing in our society is fundamentally wrong when it comes down to people in the most precarious and challenging of situations. Sorry it's political, sorry it's personal, but that's how I feel. No mother of 4 should be prostituting herself this way to just get basic accommodation. And Gary Allen can see straight away, perfect opportunity to take advantage of her. You know, they develop a friendship. We'll put that in inverted commas because there's no doubt whatsoever that Gary Allen is not looking at her as a friend. He's looking at her as somebody that he can exploit. She's desperate. So Alena basically begins visiting Gary Allen's flat at 13A Bredbury Close, Rawmarsh. And you know what? He'd give her a drink, probably because of the fact that would make her even more vulnerable. And it turns out, on the 26th of December 2018, Alena makes the gross error of believing that Gary Allen is her friend. So she goes to his flat uninvited. I know. What a guilty thing to do. What an aggressive action to go and visit a friend. Because I don't know about you, but I always think that friends let you visit them, right? But no. Gary Allen sees her turning up uninvited as a major overstep in their friendship. And he's furious. He throws her out, has a massive confrontation with her, and Allen even chose to record what was said. And it was chilling. Have a listen.
I understand fully well. You're taking me for a idiot. And I don't need it. And I don't want you. And I don't want this. Now, listen. Get the out of my flat or I'm going to chuck you out.
You don't like me.
Get out!
Done.
Okay. Bed. Get out!
That's it. Drink it, this go to the court. Okay.
Get out!
I'm going. I'm coming here for you.
Get out.
And why can I go?
You can go for a walk.
How about now? Please, please. I'll please.
Goodbye.
Good. Let me. No good me.
Get
Give
out.
me water. Water, please. No,
No.
good me.
I don't give a
Give me water.
Get out of my life, Alena. I
Water.
didn't ask you to come here. No. Nothing now. You can I didn't ask you to come here.
Darling, I'm not dead. Just water. Give me here.
No.
Please, everybody.
Get out. Get out, Alena. I didn't ask you to come here, and you're a pain in the.
Give me water.
No.
Please.
No.
You know like what?
Get out.
Okay. You're putting me. Please.
Get out and stay out. I will throw you out if you don't get out of my life. I don't give a about you. You've come to my home and you've behaved like a stupid. I don't want you here.
Give me water.
No. I didn't ask you to come here. I'm quite happy to be on my own for Christmas. I'll give a get the out of my life. Go on. And Alena, if you knock on my door again, I'm coming out here and I'm going to beat the out of you. I'm not kidding.
I'm here.
No, I'm not giving you all. I want you to off. Get out of my life. Get walking. Don't come back here again. Do not knock on my door again.
Thank you.
Okay? If you knock on my door again, I'm knocking the out of you. It's that simple.
Yeah.
You have got to be kidding me after what I've just said. Okay? Well, what's your friends? Get over there. I don't want you here. I don't give a get walking. I'm not your friend. Get the out. Go on. Get walking. Think I'm about. Get walking. I don't want to see you again.
I mean, what is going through someone's head when they are so calculated, when they are so in control of an apparent scenario where you're meant to be out of control? Listen, when you're angry with somebody, when you're truly angry with them, the last thing that you're thinking of doing is recording your altercation with them. That's controlled. That's something that you're aiming to capture because you like capturing it. You are not angry. You are using your action of seeming angry to create the fantasy that you're trying to create, and that's really important to acknowledge. So he records that. Alena's last seen alive that Boxing Day evening. She's seen leaving Alan's home and going to a nearby pub. However, it's believed that she was killed by Alan later that night or in the early hours of the following morning, having returned to his flat, which is just horrific. She goes and has some drinks. She probably thinks it's going to be all right, goes back there, and the consequences are fatal for her. And it's Alena's husband who reports her missing. Her body was discovered 3 months later, 8th of April 2019. And very similarly to Samantha, she's found partially buried in a stream. And it's a police officer who is in the area and he just notices the smell of decomposing flesh. And that is coming from the stream, and that's where they discover her remains. And I was talking yesterday to former DCI Paul Settle, and he said there are two smells that you realise that you'll always recognise on the job. You'll only have to smell them once. And he said one is marijuana and the other is rotten flesh. And I think that that's very true. I think any of us who have come across something that is rotting, that smell is very much aversion based. We're not meant to feel anything but repulsion because obviously we're not meant to eat it. And likewise with human flesh, that's going to be on steroids, the reaction, because of the fact that there is nothing like meeting a contemporary who's in such a situation. Now, what the officer notes is that stones have been placed on her body, and the way that they'd done that was to try to weigh her down to conceal her. It was also very obvious just from looking that she'd had some incredibly serious injuries to her neck because her head was basically bent in an unnaturally extended position. She was also naked from the waist down, and a pathologist had later confirmed that Alena, like Samantha, had been strangled to death. Now, due to the length of time that Alena had been dead in the water, obviously her body was in a really high level state of decomposition. So when the police start investigating her murder, one of the things that they quickly identify is significant telephone contact between Alan and Alena on the phone before she disappeared. Also, the police start looking at Gary Allen's movements in the days following her murder, and Gary Allen had purchased hand towels, a shovel, and gloves, which clearly are highly implicating. He'd then gone to the place where Alena's body had been dumped, and he'd evidently done his best to conceal the body. And as with Samantha, the truth is, he had no doubt in his mind that he'd got away with another murder. And understandably, there'd been 3 months that had passed. This guy thinks that he can do whatever he wants. And at this point, remember, it's the second definite death, the murder, and there's been a cooling off period. What does that mean? It means he fits a serial killer profile. Alan is ultimately arrested in April 2019. And during that investigation, Gary Allen's mobile phone is seized, and it is found to contain images of naked and semi-naked dead women covered in blood. What does that tell you? The fact that he had pictures of naked and semi-naked women dead, covered in blood. And some of those were listed as prostitutes who had been strangled to death with ligatures. Now, I'm not saying he did that. I'm just saying the fact that he was morbidly fascinated by dead women covered in blood who'd also been strangled with ligatures says that, again, even if he had nothing to do with those, the fantasies that he was living, the violent connections he was making with those demonstrates that this is an individual who is consistently thinking of what they want to do if not doing it. It clearly reflects his warped mind. It clearly reflects his attitudes towards women, particularly prostitutes. You know, he has that absolute distaste for sex workers. He'd also, on his phone, searched for things like ways to commit a perfect murder. I've got a bit of advice for you, Gary Allen. Don't search ways to commit a perfect murder. That would be point A. Point B, don't have incriminating evidence on your phone. Just two very simple ways to make you being caught as a mastermind murderer more difficult. But as you're not a mastermind murder and you're just somebody who got let off because you were very lucky and a jury clearly didn't listen to the evidence appropriately, you managed to be a person walking the streets for too long. But you know what? It does blow my mind that a lot of these incredible murderers who think they're so superior often get caught because they've done exactly this. On their own material, use a library. I don't know why I'm giving advice as to how to do that. I'm just saying, use one with a VPN, a library. They're the kind of things that you do. But never mind, I'm not a criminal mastermind. I've just done a lot of work around this stuff, and this is what I've garnered from it. Police also managed to obtain CCTV footage from Gary Allen's neighbours, and it shows Alena going in and out of Allen's property. Also, a big problem is that the drains in his area have become really blocked at the properties where he lives. And what the police find is a football-sized ball of wet wipes from Gary Allen's flats, and that's the cause. So he'd clearly been wiping everything down. Why would you do that? Why would you go around wiping down every surface in your home? I mean, that in itself mounts suspicion, doesn't it? And it's at this point that the police are like, we have got enough evidence against Gary Allen. As far as they were concerned, they had a solid case against him in relation to Alena's death. He's the last to see her alive. The threatening recordings at his property, his purchase of tools to conceal a body and visits to the murder location. And they also had the new compelling evidence, as far as they were concerned, that would be all they needed to retry him for the 1997 murder of Samantha. So, look at my smile. In 2019, the DPP made an application to the Court of Appeal to have Allen's acquittal for Samantha's murder overturned. DPP Max Hill QC personally presented the new evidence to the Court of Appeal, and what they outlined with that evidence was Allen's pattern of offending. Basically, he targeted sex workers and he killed by strangulation. Comments to probation officers regarding his attitude towards sex workers. Recordings that had been made by the undercover officers, his confession to Ian. These were all big new pieces of information when you put them together, right? They might individually not make up a story, but certainly they are compelling when you add them together. So Allen's acquittal was quashed. Oh yeah. And the retrial for Samantha's murder was granted by the court. So he didn't get away with it. But of course, we've got to go to court. Is he going to get found guilty? So at trial at Sheffield Crown Court earlier this year, it's 2021, it's only this year, Allen faced 2 counts of murder in relation to Samantha and Alena's deaths. Now, he claimed, like so many career criminals, that he'd been fitted up in a conspiracy and that probation officers had lied about what he'd said. Yes, Gary Allen, I don't think it's about what you said that got them to put in order this new case. I think it's what you admitted. I think it's what you recorded as well. I think it's the pictures on your phone. I could list it. But again, it's not him. He's been fitted up. It's all a conspiracy. Even when it comes down to his recorded confession, it's like, oh, you know what? I just told Ian that, the undercover police officer Ian, that he wanted to hear that stuff, so I just gave it to him. I just wanted to seem like I was confident and I could go ahead and get on with the crime that he was asking me to commit. Again, the irony. I love it when criminals come out with things that are just so incriminating, ironic. It's like, listen, I didn't kill the prostitute. I didn't kill her. All I wanted to do was to prove to Ian, the person I thought I was going to go and kill somebody for, that I could kill somebody. So me wanting to kill somebody for him needed me to say that I'd killed somebody before. Well, Gary, I think what you're saying there is you're an individual who's quite happy to go and kill to somebody's orders. Is that what you're saying? Either way, it's not looking good for you. You know what I mean? It's just me whose brain analyses those things that way. But nonetheless, it doesn't look good for him. So obviously he's trying to say that he's passed himself off as the criminally minded because he just wanted to big himself up. And he also claimed, bizarrely, that he hadn't known Alena was a sex worker. Okay. This is flimsy, Gary Allen, but we understand why you've got this kind of mindset. It's because you got away with it before, and so you somehow believe that time hasn't moved on, evidence isn't stronger, and let's be honest, that a jury isn't stupid. The trial lasts 7 weeks, so it's a big old trial, and throughout it, one of the things that people know who watch him is that he just is really impassive. He's hugely arrogant throughout, and at one stage during cross-examination by the prosecution, he actually states, "Stop with the commentary. and just ask me the questions. You don't want to do that. The one thing about being in court is there's a jury there. A jury doesn't want to see arrogant. A jury doesn't want to see superior. A jury wants to see serious. A jury wants to see authentic. A jury wants to see truthful. And if you start acting like you feel that you're in charge, you are giving a very clear indication to your nature. So the very fact that he is arrogant in this way demonstrates that the jury would likely be thinking this is a man with power problems. We can also acknowledge that he's an individual who doesn't really care that much about prison. He's been there before, doubled his time, seemed to be okay. So maybe the consequences of his actions don't figure in the way that they would for you or I. So after 2 days of deliberation, so that's a fair old amount of time, the jury do find him guilty of 2 counts of murder, and that was in June this year, 2021. So finally, after over 20 years, Alan's been held accountable for Samantha's murder. And at the sentencing hearing, the judge, Mr. Justice Goose, had decided what minimum term Alan should serve. Now, we know it's life, because murder is always life, but there are different rationales to the length of life. In the States, that would be forever, but in the UK, it is not that case. It's very rare that we give people a full life term. So what the judge has to do, as we know, is look at aggravating, mitigating factors. So he identified several aggravating factors, including significant degree of premeditation, of twisted mindset towards workers that were sex workers, and that he indicated with this that Gary Allen went and targeted his victims specifically. The nature of Samantha's murders were particularly horrific. He caused significant suffering before she died. He inflicted extensive injuries upon her. He drove a car over her body. He attempted to conceal both of the bodies of his victims. He also destroyed vital evidence. After killing Samantha, he scrapped the car, and he also has previous serious convictions. They are big aggravating factors, and there aren't pretty much any mitigating factors. So ultimately, the judge decided that he was going to go to prison for a term of 37 years. He's not going to get out. So that's it for Gary Allen. The likelihood is he's going to be in prison forever. And what we know of his behaviour, it's probably going to get more years added because he just can't contain himself. It's not within his nature. He is a violent offender of the worst kind. And I think that he'll spend his time in prison causing huge amounts of problems. Also want to bring in the fact that the judge really praised the work of the police, in particular the undercover police officers who gave up 2 years of their lives to create this spider's web of opportunity to catch him. Now, after the hearing, Samantha's daughter, Sophia, stated, "Gary Allen may have his sentence, but my family and I will continue to suffer the bigger sentence. I can never have my mother back. I've got to live with that, and there will always be a break in my heart." It's always the families, isn't it? Aside from the heinous experience of the poor victim who loses their life in such a horrible situation, what we see are the ripple effects of that loss, and it's forever. This was actually the first case in UK history involving both a double murder and the double jeopardy rule. So Gary Allen's killings were 21 years apart, but he was ultimately brought to justice for both. However, I need to be honest here, and I think that any of you listening to me today, you will know where I'm going with this. I think that the authorities are absolutely right in their suspicion that he probably committed many, many more offences and possibly many more murders, because this man constantly lived in a state of fantasy about wishing to do harm, and he had access and opportunity, and he also was organised. So to some degree, are we looking at a man who killed 2 people, or are we looking at a man who killed many? And whether we'll ever find that out is something that time will tell. What we know is his evil mindset and targeting of prostitutes, vulnerable and readily available victims definitely supports this theory. It really does. They were available, they were vulnerable, he had access, and that makes them in a very precarious situation. Following his conviction, police around the UK were actually asked to look again at unsolved violent crimes because the National Crime Agency currently are looking at unsolved attacks on sex workers, and the reason they're doing that is because they think there are definite possible links back to Allen. And if you look at organised offenders, and undoubtedly Gary Allen definitely is an organised offender, but if you look at quite a lot of the serial killers who are highly organised and get away with it for a long time. The reason for that is they are really difficult to apprehend. It's really possible that, as far as I'm concerned, he is a serial killer with many more murders to his name. So I would say watch this space, because there is a strong possibility that at some point in the future, I am going to be doing another few videos on cases that went cold that we find are associated with Gary Allen as the perpetrator. I would be really, really surprised if that doesn't happen in the future. Let's see, as he goes through the prison system, I'm sure there will be many opportunities for him to speak to people, and it's whether he can keep that superiority and arrogance under wraps to a point where he doesn't blab because of his need to tell people how superior he is, you know, and how he wants to live out those fantasies. And of course, in prison, you're going to have to find willing parties who'll listen to that. And very often those willing parties aren't that willing and end up going and telling people about what you've said, thus leading to you being found guilty for other murders. Irrespective, even if not, this guy's not going to get out, is he? He's not going to be walking our streets. Of course, the problem with somebody like Gary Allen is that there is a potential that he may never speak about other people that he's murdered because of the fact that he knows that gives him power and dominance over the individuals and the families that essentially he affected by his actions. And that is always the problem with some offenders. That's a classic example of somebody like Levi Belfield. You know, he doesn't talk about things, not because he maybe doesn't wish to, but because he doesn't want to give away anything that could implicate him elsewhere. He likes to hold on to that. It gives him power over people. And unfortunately, that's the system in the UK that we have, because we can't forcibly make people speak about things, even if we wish we could at times. Torture is not acceptable in the UK. It is an infringement on human rights, although sometimes we question, why have these people got human rights? But then again, it says something about a civilised society that they have. I hope you found that an interesting case. Like I said, it's really current in the fact that whilst his crimes were over a long period of time, due to the diligence and the intense connection the police had with those individuals that they felt deserved justice, we are in a position where this man is off our streets, and that is a good thing. And like I said, I think sometimes we can get quite jaded about investigations, and we can imagine that the police aren't really diligent in the way that we wish them to be. But here is an example of incredible police work and an incredible result, including justice for Samantha, something that felt like a case that had gone really cold. Join me again next time where I'll be covering another case. I have quite a few because you keep sending them me and then we keep doing them, and it's like I'm being introduced to cases I've never heard of before. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this one in the way of me actually exploring it, not in the fact that the crimes had occurred, please do give me a subscribe. I love your comments. I love your communication. I love your likes. Thank you very much. Again, shout out to Patreon. Enjoy the podcast that I'm going to be doing. I hope you do. And I will see you again next time for another true crime with me, Emma Kenny. Take care, guys.